Today is post day. That means we get to open packages. Let's see what we got. First thing, coming in from Germany, got some packing material. This is plaster bandages. Same thing it used to make casts for when you break your leg, which I did when I was about 5 years old. These are to make mother molds. If you do something like mold a rock or a tree or something like that, you're gonna lose the three-dimensional shape unless you back up the mold on the outside with a mother mold. It's like Christmas. What can it be? It's a human head. Always good to have a human head. Keep ahead of things. A little bottle of silicone thickener. Silicone. The idea is you put on one thinner layer of silicone first, then make another batch, thicken it up a little bit so you can use it more like a putty on the outside, then cover that with the mother mold so you can remove it later. Mold release, PVC foam. The idea is you mix part A with part B and then it expands. I got a relatively high expansion rate thing. You can get it 50 times expansion of the original amounts to twice or maybe 3 times. The less it expands, the harder it is. So you can actually make functional pieces or you can use it to insulate a boat. So I went for something that was a little harder than totally soft, but not so rigid because I figure I'm going to cover it with epoxy anyway, and I'll probably want to chop it up. All I want for Christmas is silicone.
If you've been following some of my other videos, you know that part of my project was to build an ultra-realistic tree out of spray polyurethane. Well, as realistic as I could make it. So the carving went great, but I knew I needed a texture to really make it feel real. I tried using one of these things that you can get for a cake, and I wasn't so happy with the texture when you pressed it into the foam. So I knew I needed to make some casts and actually apply them to the outside of the tree after I had made those casts. My thinking was, well, I could try to carve this the best I could, but if it already exists, why not just make a copy? There's so many things you can make casts out of, I decided I'd set up some guidelines just to give a direction to it. I knew for sure I wanted something lightweight, waterproof, and flexible. But I also wanted something non-toxic, without a bunch of fumes, and something that wasn't gonna just completely break the bank. So that pretty much eliminated fiberglass, plaster, and even epoxy clays. And I kinda wanted to find something new and different that maybe other people could do that wouldn't cost so much. And ideally, could be built using materials you could find just around the corner. So that's how I started going in the direction of foams. But the question was, should I use a 2-part foam or should I use a spray foam? And that required some experiment. I found tons of examples of people who use 2-part polyurethanes to make all sorts of casts. And of course I found lots of examples of people using spray foams for DIY terrariums. On the other hand, I couldn't find a single example of anyone who had used spray foams to make terrarium castings. Though I did find one guy who used it as a step to make a cool metal skull. I didn't really want to waste too many materials, so I did all my experiments on a smaller model of the eventual silicone mold that I was going to make off a real tree. The process is exactly the same. First, you need a silicone mold that actually captures the texture of whatever you're trying to cast. To support this texture, you need some sort of box or a mother mold so that it holds in the correct 3-dimensional shape. And when you do the actual casting, unlike with Jello where you can just pour it into the mold and stick it into the fridge until it cools, with foams, it's super important to cover the mold as you're making the casting. This allows back pressure to build up inside, and that's what actually captures the detail of whatever you're trying to cast. What I wanted to see was, number 1, does it capture the surface detail accurately? And number 2, can I build with it? And that includes its cost. I decided to test the 2-part polyurethane foam first. I was actually pretty surprised at how much of the stuff it took to put into my mold. It wasn't cheap and I was pretty concerned about it. After covering it, weighting it down, and letting it cure, I finally took it apart and pulled out the casting. The detail capture on the surface was okay, but it was not exactly what I was hoping for. But what really bothered me was that the overall material was very brittle and fragile. I was concerned it was going to be tough to work with, and it certainly wasn't cheap. Next, I checked out the spray polyurethane foam, doing the same thing. But this time, when I pulled apart the mold and pulled out the actual casting, the detail was awesome. The pieces were super light, not brittle at all, and the material was pretty inexpensive. Spray foam was definitely the right choice. Now I knew exactly which foam I wanted to use, I just needed a tree to make a good cast from.
So it looks like it's finally time to do a little bit of mold making. We're gonna do some silicone, paper towel, silicone molding compound, separation spray, got just about everything, we'll see. So here we go.
I knew a place that was right near where I lived, where I was sure I could find a tree really easily. One that would have great texture for the bark, one that I could mold really easily. This would take no time at all.
Gonna go find some trees to see if we can make a silicone mold.
But what started out as a pretty easy task actually turned out to be pretty difficult. There were tons of trees around, but very few of them had the kind of bark I was looking for. Some were too small, some were too big, some were too smooth, and some were just too rough. Of course, I knew I would never find a real tropical tree in this forest, but I wanted to find something that had an interesting looking bark that would really add to the realistic tree I was making. And if any botanist came and complained that it wasn't a real rainforest tree bark, well, I'd just tell him it was an introduced species. Finally, we found exactly what we were looking for. A tree that had excellent texture and was easy to get to. It was time to make a silicone mold.
So, we got a tree here we're gonna try to take a mold of.
Whenever you do a cast, one of the first and most important things is to make sure that your surface is really well prepared. This means it has to be free of all dust, grease, and anything that could stick to the mold making compound. And then, of course, you need something to prevent the silicone from sticking to the surface. For the tree bark, I used plain old uncatalyzed epoxy resin. And it took me about 15 minutes to make sure the whole surface was completely covered, but still not pooling anywhere that could hide details later. Finally, it was time to pour my very first silicone layer. When you're mixing silicone, it's really important to get the proportions exactly right, so read the label and do the exact mix for the particular brand you have. But whichever type of silicone you use, once you mix the two parts together, you've got to work quickly because you have a limited amount of time before it sets up completely. So once it's totally mixed up, it's time to spread it out and make sure it goes into every little crack and space. This first layer of silicone is pretty thin and not all that strong. After all, its main purpose is just to capture the detail of the surface so we can reproduce it later. That's why it's super important that we add a second layer of silicone to which we've added a thickening agent so it spreads a bit like putty. This second layer can go on just as soon as the first layer is hard enough it doesn't mess up the details. Silicones come in different hardness ratings depending on how rigid you want your final product to be. In my case, I went for a short A rating of 10 because I knew I wanted something soft, stretchy, and elastic that would pull off of any undercutting that was on the bark and give me a flexible mold. But of course, that meant that I needed to make a mother mold.
It's been about 4 or 5 hours, so this should be cured. It feels pretty cured. Now I've got to quickly make a mother mold because we're losing light here. I want to get this out of here before it gets dark.
The whole idea of a mother mold is just to provide a support structure for the silicone mold, which itself is pretty floppy. All you need for this step are these bandage strips and some water. Prepare the bandage strips by simply tearing off short pieces and folding them into thirds, like a letter. Continue doing this until you have enough plaster that you think is going to cover the surface. In my case, it took about 3 rolls. Take a piece, dip it in water, wring it out, and lay it out as smoothly as possible. Be sure to flip over the hairy edge so you get a smooth edge to your mold. Continue until the entire surface is covered. The thicker it gets, the faster it sets, so work quickly. And it's always a good idea to use registration keys to make sure it's easy to align your mother mold and your silicone mold later. For this mold, the surface was so bumpy it served as its own registration keys. It only takes about 20 minutes before the plaster is cured and is hard enough that you can lift the mother mold right off the surface. And of course, the silicone mold is still on the surface, so our next step is going to be to pull that mold off without damaging it. So at this point, I was super happy I chose a soft, elastic silicone because that meant removing the mold was pretty straightforward. I just had to move carefully and slowly to avoid tearing anything. And we're done. All the molding is ready, and now we can take the molds back home, clean them up, and get to casting. One of the first things that I did when I got my mold back home was to get it under some water and clean it off as much as possible. I found that no matter how well I prepared my surface beforehand, there are always some little bits of the bark that got embedded into the silicone. You really don't want these pieces to be embedded into your final cast, so it's worth taking the time to wash it off carefully with water, and if necessary, get some tweezers and pull out the pieces. And when it's clean, it's time to mold. I had already discovered that back pressure was super important to getting accurate details in the final cast, so I built this styrofoam box around my mother mold. This way I could cover it, and when I put my foam in, it would make a killer cast. Now, spray foam sticks to absolutely everything, so be sure to wear gloves and use plenty of separation spray and Vaseline on anything you don't want it to stick to. Be sure to shake your foam well and get spraying. It's really hard to estimate exactly how much foam you're going to need. Too little and it won't expand enough to get a good details in the mold, but too much and it's going to blow the cover right off the top of the mold. Polyurethane foams start curing upon exposure to moisture, so it's super important to spray a little bit of water on there before we cover it up and block exposure to the air. And don't forget to add weights to build up that back pressure to get a good mold. I found that the foam generally cured in about an hour or two. It all depended on how much water I had misted onto the foam as I was putting it into the mold. To get the cast out of the mold, I turned the whole thing upside down and then pulled the plastic wrap off the wooden cover. This made it so much easier to get to the foam and work it out. I used a sharp utility blade to trim off the extra flashing that squeezed out between the mold and the cover. And then it was just a question of wiggling it and working it out by hand. Because I didn't use registration keys, I found that my silicone mold often came out stuck to the cast. No big deal, but maybe next time I'll use them. But as far as the cast is concerned, I was super happy with the way it came out. All these details, and with my silicone mold, I could make as many as I wanted. Inside is a silicone mold I made last night, and that is the first piece taken off. So, this is light as a feather, basically a piece of tree bark with perfect detail. Cool. In order to use these castings as veneers on my realistic foam tree I was making, I knew I would have to thin them out a little bit, otherwise I wouldn't be able to attach them. So I took out a bread knife and started slicing and dicing. I found it was pretty straightforward, but it took a bit of time. And it might seem like this was a huge waste of spray foam, but I actually saved all those pieces and I reused them when I was building the artificial rock of the background later. But that's another video. When I started out this project with the idea to make a realistic foam tree, I had no idea of how much I was getting into. And there were so many things I learned along the way. How to mold foam, how to cast foam, and how to apply foam to this tree. The path hasn't always been the straightest, and I've learned a lot of things and had to make up a lot of techniques as I went along. But in the end, I'm super happy I did it. I had already invested so much time and energy into making this foam tree, I wanted something to bring it to the next level. And that's exactly what these foam castings did. Each piece of veneer had to be shaped perfectly, and especially for where it was going on the tree. I found the best look was when I tore it instead of using a blade. I tried a whole bunch of different techniques to get the veneers to stick to the artificial tree I had carved, but what worked the best was simple styrofoam cement. It's water-based, easy to work with, and it's really thick, which was perfect to help fill the gaps between the veneer and the rough foam surface. And as I placed each piece of veneer, I used toothpicks to hold it in place until the glue was dry. And for any stubborn little pieces that just wouldn't stick down, well, that's when I used spray glue. Even though the foam bark looked really good at this point, it's important to point out that this was just kind of the first step in making my final realistic foam tree. After all, the foam here is not that sturdy. It needs to be covered with something like epoxy or Drylock if you want, in order to protect it from the elements. Raw polyurethane foam is just not that sturdy, but it does provide a great structure to build on. After all, my realistic foam tree wasn't just a question of looking good, it was also supposed to be functional. There's a heating pad, there's a light, there's a hide, but all that's the subject of another video.